Welcome to the next edition of Grid Forward Chats. I'm Bryce Yonker. Today we have with us Henry Sanderson. Henry comes to us from the other side of the pond. He's the executive director of Benchmark Mineral Intelligence and is a leading analyst on electric vehicle supply chains. He's worked previously for Financial Times in London, Bloomberg, before that in Beijing. And I learned about Henry because he's an author. You can't see me holding up. I know we only show our audio, but I'm holding a book that I really enjoyed reading. It's called Volt Rush: The Winners and Losers in the Race to Go Green. Thanks for being on with us, Henry.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So maybe you can start off just briefly. Tell us a little bit about your background and what are you doing currently?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I've been a journalist for all of my career, mostly in China. I lived in Beijing for 7 years. And then I came back to London in 2014 to work for Financial Times covering commodities. And that's how I got into the minerals that we need for the energy transition and became aware of, the demand increase for these minerals and some of the issues with the supply chains and the problems behind that, and also the geopolitical issues of China's dominance. I've always been interested in clean energy, and I lived in China when we had some of the worst air pollution they've recorded. So the kind of interest came together, and that's why I wrote this book, which is all about the supply chains behind your electric vehicle and behind clean energy that are more visible now, but when I started writing it, were not so visible.
Great. Well, Henry, diving into something like a comprehensive publication and a book like that's a major endeavor. When did you decide to tackle that? What did that process look like?
Yeah, so I decided to write the book. As I said, I became aware of the scale of the minerals we needed for the clean energy transition, and working as a journalist covering this area. I became very interested in the idea of, writing a book just to explain to people what was going on and some of the sort of hidden, bringing to the fore some of the hidden things behind the supply chain. So I guess around 2015, 2016, I had the idea for writing the book. At that time, also in the commodity markets, the sort of age of China's heavy industry boom, the commodity super cycle had come to an end, and mining companies were becoming very conservative, and there were no really big deals or any of that sort of excitement. So I was looking around for the next big theme. So that's when I came upon this topic.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about kind of maybe I'll call it the basics of the base of the supply chain. So a lot of our community that's working on the end assets that are coming to the grid, I don't know that they have as much of an appreciation of what starts these whole capabilities. So can you talk broadly about the base of the supply chain, the sort of resources that are required for the energy transition? And I've got a few follow-up questions on these areas I'll ask you about as well.
Yes, so you're right. So anything before it becomes a product, is either mined or grown. So if you talk about clean energy, it's quite really eye-opening how much depends on raw materials, and pretty much every technology does. But if you look at batteries, which is the one I look at, there are basically two big battery chemistries at the moment: lithium iron phosphate, which is called LFP, and NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt, the two big technologies that probably you and I would find in our electric vehicles, and they have quite different raw material requirements. So for LFP, which is used in energy storage and grid storage mostly, lithium, phosphate, and the main materials, and then graphite or graphite silicon in the anode, and in the other technologies, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and again graphite or silicon in the anode, and also batteries have aluminium and copper in them as well. So if you think about if you look at underneath your electric vehicle, the size of the battery pack, is quite significant. It's not only a big part of the cost, but a big part of the weight of the vehicle. And then you're talking about, we need to replace fossil fuel vehicles with electric vehicles. So it's a huge task. So a huge amount of raw materials are required. And what really is part of the issue is something like lithium was really, before this, serving quite niche markets. So suddenly lithium supply has to expand quite rapidly to meet demand of electric vehicles and grid scale storage. So this is putting a lot of pressure on the market. And also nickel and cobalt, copper and aluminium. I mean, they all have other markets and other uses. But again, we see that batteries are beginning to become the main sort of driver of demand. So again, that's really the demand pool. And I think, global EV sales are really accelerated, and it's been very dominated by China. China's about 60%, of all EV sales, and EV sales in China are about 30% of new sales. So China has really been dominant in this market, but now we're seeing, Europe and the US increase. But the scale of it, the scale of the challenge, as you know, as well as I, right, is massive.
Yeah. So you, as you said, you focus a lot of the attention on the materials required for the next generation batteries, the incoming capabilities of, in electrified transportation. So you mentioned lithium, nickel, cobalt, but you didn't cover as many of the other elements required for digital transformation, or the core assets of the grid. So, copper, silicon, steel. Outside of the areas of the book, do you have any other thoughts around important dynamics that are unfolding at kind of the base of the supply chain right now?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Copper, you mentioned. I mean, EVs contain, around 3 to 4 times the amount of copper than a gasoline vehicle. And we obviously need copper for wiring, for grids, for wind turbines. So, copper really is going to be in high demand. I do cover what copper in one chapter. But there are many other metals and materials that are going to be needed, such as rare earth elements I didn't really cover, but rare earth permanent magnets are used in electric vehicle motors, but also wind turbines, and especially offshore. Here in the UK, offshore wind is a growing part of our electricity mix. They use rare earth permanent magnets. So that's another material that's going to be needed. But if you look at solar uses silver. If you look at fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cells, platinum is another material. So pretty much any technology you're looking at, we're going to need materials in some shape or form.
Yeah, maybe we can pivot over a little bit to the kind of the geopolitics and the location-based analysis that you have in the book. So there are a number of fascinating deep dives that you do, in the various chapters when you're covering the different materials. Maybe you can highlight a couple. What really stands out to you when you think back on the project that you undertook? Is there a location or two that really kind of stands out with really interesting and important dynamics that are unfolding?
Yeah, I think visiting China is always fascinating, just to see the speed at which investment happens, and also I think seeing some of these plants in China. The people you see working there are in lab coats on machines. It's not low level labor that it used to be in China. It's all very sophisticated. But again, the scale of these plants, for instance, the lithium processing plants, the scale of the process, the energy intensity of the process, it really brings home the challenge of building out these supply chains. And then at the other end, going to Democratic Republic of Congo, seeing where the cobalt and copper comes from. And so, I went both to DRC and then saw again where that cobalt went to in China. So I saw both ends of that supply chain. And, again, the sense of, the complexity of the supply chain, the energy intensity of it. These are big plants in China that are needed to process this material. And I think also the human impact, right? The people mining in the DRC. When you get down to that level, it's quite basic in terms of people going out to mine. I mean, there aren't that many economic opportunities there. So, of course, going out to dig for cobalt and copper and selling it is one of the opportunities. But just seeing that sort of firsthand is quite eye opening, right? And you really see where the materials that we rely on come from at the very source.
You highlight a number of locations that are pretty significant, prominent, crucial, arguably, for certain global material supply chains. And it shocks me. Maybe that was a key output of your book. How locationally specific some of these materials are. Is there anything? I mean, you highlighted DR Congo. Is there any other places, or certain materials that you feel like the global supply chain is really especially reliant upon that you just want to kind of recap again?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, unlike oil, it's more concentrated than oil, where we have, over 60% of the cobalt coming from the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. In terms of lithium, it's really Australia and Chile at this moment. Obviously, Argentina and China coming up. But, it's very concentrated. And then again, China really being so dominant in the processing of these minerals, the production of battery materials, the production of batteries, being very dominant in all these stages. So the whole supply chain from raw material to battery is quite concentrated. And this is really the issue at the moment, which is, how do we diversify some of these supply chains? And also geopolitically, the West isn't so happy having China with such a dominant role. But what kind of diversification are we looking for? What does de-risking mean, which is what they talk about? So what kind of supply chains are we trying to create in the future? But definitely we need to diversify them, right? And I think this goes back to, the basic principles. You don't want to be beholden to sort of one country or one supply chain. And also from a climate change risk point of view, there's more and more risks in these supply chains. So it's absolutely critical that we diversify. But the question then is at what cost? And, we don't want to completely give up the economics of clean energy that have been, the cost has been coming down and down and down, right? We don't want that to totally reverse. We're already seeing in sectors like wind and offshore wind that the cost increases are causing big problems for businesses.
Well, this wasn't something really that you foresaw in the book itself, but it's too timely to not ask. So obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has impacted global energy markets, Europe more so, which Europe seems to have its feet under itself a bit. But do you have any thoughts about how that ongoing situation teaches us about kind of the interdependencies and the geopolitics of global energy ecosystems?
Yeah, so I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is going on as we speak. I think it really, was a huge problem for Europe because of they used gas as a weapon, but I think it's accelerated the the determination of Europe to move towards renewable energy, to come up with and it coincided with a lot of rising concerns about China as dominance in clean energy. So these two things have come together in quite a potent mix of, determination to move forward with clean energy, but also reduce reliance on China. But it is impressive, how Europe, made up for the shortfall of gas and survived, what looked like at the time quite a tricky situation. But I do think, the issue also for Europe is high energy costs. If we are going to build out this supply chain, compete with China, we need to be competitive from an energy cost, labor cost point of view, etc. So that's all an issue. And we've got we've had rising interest rates in Europe. That's a huge problem. And as I say, we're already seeing that in cost increases for clean energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we can turn our attention on a topic that our community is very familiar with and I know is super adjacent to what you've been focusing on, and I'll just generally label it as federal investments in industrial policy. So around the world, federal governments are actively, and in some cases quite aggressively, investing in advancing energy systems. And some of those are very specifically focused at expanding capacity all the way down to the base of the supply chain. What impact do you see these positions and these policies having, more near term, and then as we look a little bit further out, more long term?
Yeah, so I think the Inflation Reduction Act in the US has had a huge impact in terms of really attracting investment into these sectors. Not only does it provide very substantial, tax credits for producing batteries, for producing solar, green hydrogen, all sorts of things, right? It also just sets a clear sort of policy agenda, and we've seen a huge amount of investment go into the US, right, in a really short period of time. So that's very exciting. I guess the next step is, bringing all these projects online, making sure they're cost competitive, right? You have labor issues, other issues, and then also can the policy be sustained, right? If there's, Republican administration, etc. That's all a concern, I think. And I think in Europe, the EU, there's the same thing. We've seen new policies come out, again with ambitious targets, but again, can they actually be achieved? We actually need more money, more government support. So I think it's trickier in Europe, given the sort of rules of the European Union, than in the US. But the Inflation Reduction Act has been a real game changer, I think, and that's exactly the kind of policy that we needed, right, to supercharge this sector. And I think it's interesting because China is has been so dominant, but the West has a lot of key assets, right? It has network of allied countries like Australia, which has minerals, mining country, Canada, again a mining country. And then we have all the talent in the US and the incentives. So we definitely should be able to pull something together.
Yeah, and maybe related to both, things like the Inflation Reduction Act and infrastructure package and the industrial policies in Europe, as well as all the things that you were looking at over the years on international global supply chains. What would your thought be on the general status of the international scene for trade and collaboration? Is there pressure mounting, building, making that harder? Are we still at a place where goods are flowing reasonably seamlessly and we're able to get the products needed to where they need to go? What's your thoughts on that in general?
Yeah, so I think we did see more dislocations in COVID, etc. I think what we're seeing is it's interesting is that foreign investment in China has really collapsed, and we're seeing as I say, whole supply chains moving and shifting around, and attempts by India as well to start building these supply chains. So I do think we're seeing a shift in how global supply chains operate. But some trade tensions have been relieved, right? Like China, Australia, that situation has been relieved to some extent. And obviously, some of the COVID era disruptions have also sort of eased out. But I think big concern, to this supply chain is, the interest rates and inflation that we've seen, and a lot of companies may have fundraised at a time when interest rates were lower, but then now they want to fundraise again, and it's harder. I think that's a real challenge in an inflationary environment. Can we build out a supply chain that is going to be competitive with China, right? And China's facing a deflationary environment, so it's quite different situation.
Yeah. So we're cruising along. I have a couple other more miscellaneous questions.
Yeah, sure.
I wanted to jump in with you. One was on automation. So the extraction and processing of raw materials obviously has a high level of manual processing just baked into that, which you got to see firsthand. Are there elements of automation improvements that maybe you saw? I don't know that you covered them too much in the book, but are there any step changes that are going to bring product together in a more efficient fashion that you're kind of seeing a trend in right now?
Yeah, so I mean that's the interesting thing about the places I went in China. It's all automated, it's all robots, and as I say, you don't see people on the production line unless it's just sort of going to check something, or they're in the labs, checking the final product. So it's all automated. It's all robots. I guess we've yet to see how AI is going to impact this whole sector in terms of companies like CATL, big battery producer, huge R&D staff. Can they use AI to find new materials, new things like that? That's we have yet to see, but certainly in the battery supply chain, automation I'd say is very high. I think I guess mining is the side where probably they traditionally have been slower to adopt newer technologies. So that's probably the side where we're going to see more efficiencies and new technologies.
Great. Well, and then so my next one was, you're an analyst, so you can predict and see how close you are to those predictions. But trend curves for things like EV storage and other grid solutions can be very divergent, right? These are quickly coming upon the energy systems. And so they have dramatic impacts if there's a pretty significant shift in that line further down in the supply chain. So I guess my general question would be, if markets are going to come to fruition faster than maybe people expect, is the bottleneck the raw materials, or what sort of thoughts do you have as far as if the demand really starts speeding up, is the energy supply chain kind of at the base ready to accommodate that?
Yeah, that's right. So probably the next few years that there is going to be enough supply, but I think what we're seeing is further out, in sort of medium term, end of this decade, in the 2030s, that's when I think it looks like there's some shortages, because we need more investment now to meet that demand. And I think we're seeing that happen, where some of the big players in lithium are investing in exploration assets, which could be the mines of tomorrow, and we're seeing that kind of investment happen. But I think that's the sort of issue later in this decade and into the 2030s, and also the geopolitics of it. What's the relationship with China going to be like then? What's going to happen to our globalized world and economic system, right? So that's a sort of unknown issue. But mines take a long time to come to fruition, and that's whereas we've seen the demand for EVs increasing, and obviously energy storage as well. So can the sort of mining industry keep up, and can it invest, and can it develop these new assets? That's all of concern. And obviously, if prices for raw materials go too high, you can impact battery costs, and that could be that could be damaging as well. So this energy transition, I don't think is going to be smooth necessarily. I think there's going to be lots of sort of bumps in the road, and we have a lot of headwinds, right? We have politics, and here in the UK, debate about whether people are actually willing to make some sacrifices to reach the net zero target. So there are all these sort of headwinds that need to be resolved as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned energy transition, and in that, I often think about the communities and assets that have focused on the traditional delivery of energy for decades, sometimes longer. And you had really great proximity and case studies on some of those communities. Are there ways that people in places that have delivered traditional solutions of the past are successfully transitioning into materials and solutions that are better positioned for the future? Do any ideas or examples come to mind?
Yeah, so there's obviously lots of innovation going on. I think that the challenge in clean energy has always been, how do you scale up these innovations? How do you make them cheap and cost effective enough? And I think that's been the issue. If you look back, where a lot of venture funding went into new technologies, but yet if you look at solar, it's still the same crystalline silicon technology that's dominant, and in batteries, lithium ion is still dominant. But we do see innovations being scaled up, like sodium ion is a new battery technology that's being scaled up in China. Sodium is obviously very abundant. So what's interesting to me is can China innovate and scale up some of these new technologies going forward? Because if anyone's going to do it, they can scale it up, right? So that's going to be interesting to see. Or alternatively, will we see breakthroughs coming out in lithium or other mineral extraction, like we saw the shale revolution in oil and gas, right? So are we going to see those kind of innovations come through that will really change the supply picture? So there's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of focus on innovation and government money as well. But I think the issue for the West has been we've sometimes struggled to scale up these innovations from lab to mass market scale. And that's really the issue.
I think that's a great transition to our closing question. So, for the transformation of our energy systems and all the time you spent looking into these issues around critical materials, maybe where are you concerned most as you look ahead, near term, I would say? And then on the flip side, where are you more comfortable with the path and the trajectory that we're on now, and maybe more optimistic about where things are heading?
Yeah, so I guess I'm my biggest concern is I guess political in some sense, which is that if there are failures in the US or Europe for government supported projects, are we going to see a backlash that derails this whole effort? And also, I think the UK where I am, we don't want climate change or clean energy to become part of the political divide that we have. So it becomes, something that's, what one side of the population believe in and others don't, or used as political talking points. And, what's worrying to me is we used to have a consensus in the UK about reaching net zero, etc. And, we don't want politicians to break that and divide that. So I think really in the West, that's the issue. Do we have the staying power to compete with China, right? Do we have the political staying power? And can we avoid, the backlash? And also, there's so much, fossil fuel, lobbying or ways that we can be manipulated in the West, right? To believe one thing or the not, and so that's really my concern: is can we actually sustain this course that we're on? And also if there are bumps in the road, things like if charging's not invested in enough, will it put people off electric vehicles? Because I think it's very easy for myths to grow in society and for people to believe them, right, in this age. So that's the concern, right? We have to stay on the course that we've set. We have to somehow accelerate fast and sustain policy. Obviously in democratic systems. That's really the concern, right? And there could be delays, etc., will set us back on our target. But my hope, we're seeing all this extreme weather at the moment. That's really coming, into our, much closer than ever before. So I'm hoping that will sustain more will to proceed.
Well, Henry, thank you for taking some time with us and your reflections on this important topic area. For all of our listeners, Volt Rush, go get it. It's a great read. Thank you for taking the time to put together your experiences in that publication. And thanks for taking the time to be with us on the podcast.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care.